What happens when a seasoned pilot, trained to make split-second decisions, makes a mistake that could cost him everything? This is a story about a seemingly innocent moment at the airport that turns into a life-changing lesson. When a young boy is mistaken for a threat, one phone call to the police sends everything spiraling out of control. But what the pilot doesn't know is that the boy's father is someone with the kind of power that could flip his world upside down. Stay tuned to see how one simple mistake leads to a shocking twist that no one saw coming and the unforgettable lesson that followed. It was just another quiet morning at the airport. The familiar hum of engines reverberated through the terminal as planes prepared for takeoff, their metal bodies gleaming under the morning sun. The usual bustle of air traffic crew and ground staff filled the air, but it was calm in the cockpit. Captain Jack Peterson, a seasoned pilot with over 20 years of experience, sat at the controls of his aircraft, scanning through his flight plan for the day. The route was clear, the weather favorable, and all systems were running smoothly. With the plane set for takeoff in about an hour, Jack's mind wandered as he watched the world outside the cockpit window. He could see the passengers filtering into the terminal, the workers moving between gates, and the baggage trucks rolling past. He often found moments like this strangely peaceful. After all, the job he had chosen was one of constant attention and focus, and sometimes, these moments of calm were a welcome respite. But today, something caught his eye. Near the entrance of the terminal, a young boy, probably no older than 10 or 11, was standing by himself. He wasn't running or playing, like most children his age would be at an airport. Instead, he was standing still, looking around as though trying to make sense of his surroundings. Jack squinted, narrowing his gaze to get a better look. The boy's face was tense, almost strained, as though he was lost in thought, or perhaps lost altogether. Jack observed the boy more carefully. He was dressed in a black hoodie, the fabric slightly worn from what looked like heavy use, and a pair of cargo pants that hung loosely around his legs. He didn't appear to be distressed, but there was an unease about him. His small tattered backpack hung from one shoulder, the strap slipping off slightly, as though it was too big for him. What struck Jack as odd was that there was no adult in sight. The boy wasn't with a parent or guardian, and that was a rarity at an airport. Usually kids traveling alone were accompanied by flight attendants, or at least had someone watching over them. But this boy was all by himself, standing just a few steps away from Gate B, with no one else around. A chill ran down Jack's spine. Something about the boy's demeanor didn't sit right. The airport wasn't a place for kids to wander alone, especially in such a busy environment. Was the boy lost, or was something more sinister going on? Jack's years of flying had sharpened his instinct. As a pilot, he was trained to remain alert at all times, scanning for potential risks or irregularities, whether it was a technical issue with the aircraft or a security threat at the airport. And right now, this boy seemed to be an anomaly in an otherwise routine morning. What if he's up to something suspicious? The thought crossed Jack's mind before he could stop it. What if he was part of something bigger, or worse, involved in some kind of scheme? His mind raced, and suddenly, the boy standing alone in the crowded airport seemed far more out of place than he had a few moments ago. Jack's hand hovered over the radio control. The authorities needed to know. They could check it out, assess the situation, and ensure everything was safe. He wasn't about to take any chances. The last thing he wanted was to be the pilot who missed something important because he didn't act quickly enough. Taking a deep breath, Jack grabbed the microphone and keyed in the call to the airport authorities. His voice was steady, but there was a slight edge of uncertainty. "Hey, there's a young boy standing near Gate B. No adult supervision. Could you check it out? He looks a bit out of place." There was a brief silence on the other end of the radio, before the dispatcher responded. "Got it, Captain. We'll send someone over." The words were reassuring, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. He tried to focus on his pre-flight checks, going through the motions, but his eyes kept drifting back to the boy. He watched as the child stood there for a few more moments, looking more and more like a solitary figure in the bustling terminal. Jack leaned back in his seat, trying to shake off the gnawing unease. Had he overreacted? Maybe I'm just being paranoid, he thought. The kid is probably just waiting for a parent or something. After all, there were plenty of children who traveled alone, sometimes without a guardian in sight, depending on the circumstances. But then again, Jack couldn't help but wonder, what if he wasn't just a child lost in the crowd? What if something else was at play? the tension gnawed at him as the minutes ticked by. He could see a security guard walking toward the boy now, but Jack couldn't tell what was happening from his position. Was the boy going to be okay? Would this turn out to be just a misunderstanding? The uncertainty gnawed at Jack, and he couldn't help but replay his initial decision in his head. What if he had been wrong? Suddenly, Jack's stomach twisted. He had done what he thought was best, but there was no turning back now. The police were on their way, and in that moment, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made the wrong call. The minutes that followed seemed to stretch on for an eternity. As Captain Jack Peterson sat in the cockpit, his fingers restlessly drummed on the edge of his control panel. His mind kept replaying the decision he had made just moments ago, the radio call to the airport authorities, the request for police involvement. The boy had looked out of place, yes, but now Jack couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of doubt. Then, as if on cue, the sound of sirens cut through the hum of the airport. It wasn't a distant faint sound either, it was loud, unmistakable, and growing closer with each passing second. Jack's stomach sank. That's fast, he thought, watching as a squad car screeched into the parking lot just outside the terminal. The car came to a halt, its flashing lights casting a harsh glow across the airport's polished floor. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle, their movements purposeful and quick. They didn't waste any time. The taller of the two officers gestured toward the boy standing near Gate B, and the pair of them started walking briskly in his direction. Jack's heart thudded in his chest. He could see their serious expressions, their hands hovering near their belts, as if they were preparing for something. From his vantage point, Jack could only make out the faint figures of the officers approaching the child, but his gut twisted in response. I hope this doesn't escalate, he thought. But the unease in his stomach only grew as he watched the officers draw closer. The boy, for his part, seemed to freeze when he saw the officers. His shoulders hunched slightly, and he looked like he was trying to say something, but the words seemed to be stuck in his throat. Jack squinted, trying to catch the conversation from his position. The boy was clearly trying to explain himself, but his voice was too soft to be heard from such a distance. It was drowned out by the usual noise of the terminal, the chatter of travelers, the announcement of gate changes, the distant roar of the aircraft engines. Jack couldn't hear what the officers were saying, but their body language spoke volumes. The taller officer bent down slightly to speak directly to the boy, perhaps trying to reassure him. The shorter officer, however, stood a few steps back, eyes scanning the area as if expecting trouble to arise at any moment. But what Jack noticed most was the tense way the boy's arms remained at his sides, the way his fingers fidgeted as if unsure whether to step back or say more. He looked nervous, that was certain. He must be terrified, Jack thought. A child alone at an airport, now being approached by the police. What must be going through his mind? Did the boy feel like he was in trouble for something he didn't do? As if to answer Jack's unspoken concern, one of the officers, Jack couldn't tell which, took a step forward and gently grabbed the boy's arm. The motion wasn't rough, but it was firm. The boy didn't resist, but Jack could see the slight shift in his posture, a sign of submission, or perhaps confusion. Come on, the officer said, his voice calm but authoritative. Let's get you to the car. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His stomach tightened as he watched the officer lead the boy toward the squad car. The child's face was still a mask of uncertainty, his eyes darting nervously toward the surrounding crowd. It seemed like the situation was escalating much faster than Jack had anticipated. What if the boy was innocent? What if he wasn't causing any harm? Jack's heart hammered in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of guilt and regret. The decision had seemed so clear when he made it. He had thought he was doing the right thing by calling the authority. But now that he saw the situation unfold, he couldn't help but question himself. What if this was all a misunderstanding? What if he had just gotten an innocent child in trouble? What have I done? Jack's mind raced with that single thought. He had just made a simple call, but now he was watching the consequences play out right before his eyes. The boy hadn't even done anything wrong, he was just standing there. Jack tried to remember the boy's face, the way he had appeared so lost and out of place. But now, with the police leading him away, the weight of the situation felt heavier than ever. Jack felt his palms growing sweaty. His thoughts kept returning to the boy, to the confusion in his eyes, as he was ushered toward the squad car. I didn't mean for this to happen, Jack, but he had made the call, and the moment of truth had already passed. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Less than 15 minutes had passed since he made the radio call, and yet it felt like hours. Jack tried to refocus on his flight, to take control of his emotions, and put his mind back on the task at hand. But the image of the boy, walking silently toward the squad car, wouldn't leave him. He could still see the boy's small figure, his head hanging low, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jack's chest tightened at the thought of the child being questioned by the police, possibly even facing consequences for something that in his mind shouldn't have been a crime at all. He tried to shake off the feeling of guilt, but it lingered. The boy's fate was now in the hands of the authorities, and Jack could only hope that they would handle the situation with care. What if they didn't? What if this innocent mistake, this simple misjudgment, led to something much worse? The radio crackled, but Jack didn't hear the response. His mind was too consumed with the boy's uncertain future, and his own growing anxiety. He tried to concentrate, focusing on the pre-flight checklist in front of him. But no matter how hard he tried to push it away, his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy who had never deserved to be caught up in this mess in the first place. Jack's heart was still racing as he tried to regain his composure, focusing on the checklist in front of him. The uncertainty from the earlier situation lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing at him. Had he made the right decision? Was the boy okay? The police had taken him away, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. He tried to push the thoughts aside, reminding himself that he had a job to do. He needed to focus. The plane was ready for departure in under an hour, and there were many checks left to complete. Just as he was about to settle into the routine of verifying systems and preparing for flight, he heard a soft knock on the cockpit door. Jack turned in his seat, startled. Standing in the doorway was a man in a sharp, dark suit. The man had an aura of authority about him. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, and his eyes cold and focused, locked onto Jack with an intensity that immediately put him on edge. "Are you Captain Jack Peterson?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. There was no warmth in his tone, just business. Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" Jack replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Something about the man's presence was unsettling, and his mind raced with 100 questions. What does this guy want with me? The man's gaze didn't falter as he took a step closer, and without waiting for Jack's permission, he pulled out a badge from his suit pocket and flashed it at him. "My name is Michael Carter, I work for the FAA. What could the Federal Aviation Administration want with him?" His pulse quickened as a wave of dread swept over him. Something was wrong. This wasn't the normal procedure for a routine pre-flight check. The tone of the man's voice, the urgency in his command, it was all so much more serious than anything Jack had experienced before. His stomach twisted in knots as the reality of the situation began to settle in. Whatever this was about, it couldn't be good. Was this about the boy? Jack, had the situation escalated further than I realized? The boy was just a child, but the presence of this man, the official FAA badge, meant that something had gone terribly wrong. Without a word, Jack stood up from the cockpit and followed the man out of the plane, through the terminal, and toward a small office at the end of a corridor. His mind raced, and his anxiety grew with every step. The more he tried to grasp the situation, the more confused he became. What did the FAA have to do with an airport security matter? Was the boy in more trouble than Jack had realized? Or was it something else entirely? When they reached the office, Michael Carter motioned for Jack to enter, pushing the door open with a calm but firm gesture. Inside, Jack was taken aback. Sitting at a small table near the window was the boy, still standing, but now looking even more out of place than before. His shoulders were hunched, and his head was slightly bowed. But it wasn't just the boy who caught Jack's attention, it was the man sitting beside him. The man next to the boy was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features and an air of quiet power. His face was stern, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested he wasn't easily rattled. But there was something unsettling about the calmness in his demeanor, something that made Jack's pulse race all over again. This man wasn't just a random bystander. The boy, glancing up at the man beside him, hesitated for a moment before speaking in a quiet, almost hesitant voice. "Dad?" he asked softly, his gaze flickering between the two men. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw a flash of something: anger, frustration, maybe even disappointment, but it was gone in an instant. His face remained as stoic as ever. "Just let me handle this," the man said, his voice measured but filled with authority. He didn't even break eye contact with Jack. Jack's stomach churned. The boy's father. This is his father. The weight of the moment hit him like a ton of bricks. The boy, the one Jack had thought was a potential threat, was the son of someone with far more power and influence than Jack could have ever imagined. His mind raced as his thoughts collided with the reality of the situation. Who was this man? Jack's brain searched for any connection, anything that could explain why the boy's father seemed so familiar, yet completely out of place in the airport office. Jack was no stranger to authority figures in the aviation world, but this was different. This felt personal. Michael Carter, standing silently behind Jack, didn't offer any explanation. He simply stood there, watching as the boy's father remained composed. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Jack was still trying to piece together the situation when the man beside the boy spoke again, his voice deep and commanding. "Captain Peterson," he said, his words deliberate, "I assume you know the gravity of the situation." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but found himself unable to speak. His throat felt dry, his tongue heavy. The weight of the man's gaze made it difficult to form words. What had I done? Jack asked himself. What kind of trouble had I gotten into by calling the authorities on this boy? The man's next words only intensified Jack's growing unease. "I am Eric Carter, I am the administrator of the FAA. Jack's mind reeled as the realization hit him. The boy's father, the calm, powerful figure who had been watching him with such intensity, was none other than the head of the Federal Aviation Administration. The same FAA that oversaw everything in aviation, the same FAA whose approval Jack needed to ensure every flight was safe. Jack's stomach dropped, and the guilt washed over him. This wasn't just any random person, this was the FAA administrator, the very person whose decisions impacted everything from safety regulations to flight schedules. And Jack had just called the police on his son. It was all too much. Jack felt his face flush as the weight of his mistake came crashing down on him. He didn't know how to fix it, and for the first time in a long while, he felt utterly out of control. The room was silent for a long moment, the air thick with tension. Jack's mind raced, struggling to keep up with the sudden shift in reality. Eric Carter, the man sitting across from him, calm, composed, but undeniably powerful, finally broke the silence. "Captain Peterson," Eric began, his voice steady, almost too calm. "I'm not sure what kind of misunderstanding has occurred here, but I'll explain. My name is Eric Carter, and I am the administrator of the FAA. Jack's heart seemed to stop for a moment. The FAA, the highest authority in the aviation world. The man sitting in front of him, the father of the boy who had been dragged into this mess, was the head of the very institution that governed everything Jack knew about flying. The weight of the situation crashed down on him. The administrator of the FAA. Jack couldn't believe it. He was sitting face to face with the man who had the power to shape policy for all of aviation, someone whose influence extended across the entire industry. Eric's gaze didn't waver, his calm demeanor didn't change as he spoke again, his words measured and heavy with authority. "You've called the police on my son," he continued, his voice almost too controlled, too perfect. "I'd like to know why." Jack felt his face flush, the heat rising in his cheeks, as embarrassment threatened to swallow him whole. This wasn't just any child. This wasn't just a random passenger who had wandered into a restricted area. No, the boy he had called the police on was the son of the most powerful man in the aviation industry, and Jack's misjudgment had now put him in a position he could never have imagined. "I thought he was acting suspicious," Jack stammered, his voice faltering. "There was no adult around and I didn't know what to think." His explanation hung in the air, weak and hollow in the face of what he now understood. He could see the boy, Eric's son, sitting there, his gaze downcast, his shoulders slumped in an almost defeated posture. Jack could only imagine the hurt and confusion that this entire situation must have caused him. He hadn't meant to cause harm, but his knee-jerk reaction had set off a chain of events he couldn't undo. Eric Carter's face softened ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. There was a flicker of understanding in his expression, but it was quickly replaced by the quiet intensity of a man who had seen it all, and wasn't easily swayed. "I understand your concern," he said, his voice quiet but laced with an undeniable authority. "But you should know that my son isn't just any kid, he's my son, and I don't take kindly to people calling the authorities on him, without cause." The words stung, and Jack's stomach twisted with regret. What have I done? The realization hit him like a freight train. He had allowed his assumptions, his instincts as a pilot to cloud his judgment. The boy hadn't been doing anything wrong, he wasn't a threat, wasn't out of place. He was just a child trying to navigate a large airport to find his father's office. Jack's mind replayed the image of the boy standing alone, looking lost and anxious. Before Jack could muster a response, the boy who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. His voice was soft but clear. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes still avoiding Jack's gaze. "I was just trying to find my way to my dad's office."
Jack's heart skipped a beat. The boy's words were simple, but they cut through the fog of his own self-doubt like a blade. Just trying to find his dad's office. It was the simplest explanation, the most innocent one, and Jack had completely missed it. His assumptions had led him to a place where he had thought the worst of the situation. And now standing there, facing the boy's father, the administrator of the FAA, Jack couldn't deny the gravity of his mistake. He felt the world spin as the full weight of his error sank in. The boy hadn't been lost, hadn't been wandering aimlessly through the terminal. He had simply been trying to find his way to the FAA office, where his father worked. Jack's chest tightened as he thought back to his initial judgment, the boy with the tattered backpack, standing alone by Gate B. Jack had thought the worst because of his own preconceived notion. Why was he there alone? Was he planning something suspicious? But in the end the answer had been far simpler than Jack could have imagined. "I'm so sorry," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt hollow in his mouth, but they were all he could say. There was no undoing what had happened. He had made a rash decision, a decision that could have been avoided with just a little more patience, a little more thought. Eric Carter's eyes softened as he regarded Jack for a long moment. His stern expression remained, but there was a glimmer of something else in his gaze. Perhaps understanding, or maybe even pity. He had been in Jack's shoes once, he had no doubt seen his share of mistakes in his career. But this was different. This wasn't just an ordinary mistake. This mistake involved his son, and when it came to family, there was no room for errors. "Captain Peterson," Eric said finally, his tone changing ever so slightly, though still heavy with authority. "I know you were just doing your job, but I need you to understand that some actions cannot be undone so easily. My son is not a threat, he never was." Jack nodded, his throat tight. "I understand, I truly do." The silence in the room was thick with tension, but it was also filled with a quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. Jack realized that this wasn't just about an innocent mistake. It was about the kind of assumptions that people, including himself, often made without thinking. He had let fear guide his actions, and in doing so, he had affected not just a child, but a family with power beyond what he had ever anticipated. As Jack stood there, feeling the weight of his mistake, Eric finally spoke again, his voice now softer, but no less firm. "Let's just make sure something like this doesn't happen again. For everyone's sake." Jack nodded again, this time with a deeper understanding. The lesson had been harsh, but it was clear. Assumptions were dangerous, and in a world where everything was connected, the smallest misstep could have the largest consequence.
Eric Carter's gaze softened as he stood in front of Jack, his presence still commanding, yet there was something almost fatherly in the way he spoke. "I won't be taking this lightly, Captain, but I'll leave it to you to learn from this experience. I hope you'll remember that not every situation requires drastic action. Sometimes it's better to be patient and ask questions first." The weight of Eric's words landed on Jack like a ton of bricks. He had expected anger, perhaps even fury, but instead he was being met with wisdom and restraint. There was an air of authority in Eric's voice that left no room for argument, but there was also a deep sense of understanding, an understanding that Jack had misjudged the situation, and now it was up to him to make sure it never happened again. Jack stood there, silently absorbing every word, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the shame crawling up his neck, creeping into his cheeks. His hands were clammy as he clenched them into fists by his sides, trying to steady himself. It had been a simple mistake, a rushed judgment based on a fleeting impression, but in that instant, Jack realized that sometimes the simplest of mistakes could have ripple effects far beyond what you expected. "I promise," Jack said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, laden with guilt. "I'll be more careful next time." His words were sincere, born from the core of his regret. He wanted to prove to Eric that he had learned, that he had heard the lesson loud and clear. Eric's stern expression softened just slightly. "I hope you do, Captain. You're in a position where every decision you make affects more than just you. You're responsible for a lot of people." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "And sometimes the smallest decisions like the one you made today can cause the biggest consequence." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of Eric's words pressing down on him. He understood now, more than ever, that in his line of work, a hasty decision could affect lives, could change everything in an instant. This wasn't just about a boy at an airport. It was about the larger responsibility he had as a pilot, a person of authority in his own right. "Thank you," Jack said, his voice hoarse, as if the words were difficult to say. "I won't forget this." Without another word, Eric turned and motioned for his son to follow. The boy, who had been so quiet up until now, glanced up at Jack, his eyes still a little wary, but there was no anger in his gaze, just a quiet understanding, as if he too had learned something in the process. The father and son left the office together, and Jack stood there for a moment, alone in the silence. The sounds of the bustling airport seemed distant now, a low hum that felt far removed from the weight of the moment. Jack didn't know how long he stood there, lost in his own thoughts, but when he finally gathered himself, he left the office and made his way back to the cockpit. The journey back to his plane felt like a blur. As Jack walked down the hallway, his steps slower than usual, his mind kept replaying the conversation he'd just had. The hum of the engines, the air around him, all seemed quieter now. The world hadn't changed, but Jack had. His perspective, his understanding of his role as a pilot, and his responsibility to others, it all felt different. When he finally reached the cockpit, Jack took a deep breath before sitting down. The familiar checks, the instruments, the buttons, everything was the same, but nothing felt the same. His mind wasn't on the technicalities of the flight anymore. He wasn't worried about the altitude, the weather, or the time to take off. Instead, Jack's thoughts were consumed by the realization that sometimes, taking a moment to pause, to think and to really see the situation for what it was, could save so much more than simply acting on instinct. The pre-flight checks seemed almost automatic as Jack went through the motions, but his hands moved with more care, more mindfulness than before. He double-checked everything, not because he was afraid of missing something, but because for the first time in a long while, he understood the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It wasn't just about flying the plane safely anymore, it was about the way he interacted with the world around him, the decisions he made and how those decisions impacted the lives of others. As Jack sat in his seat, the engines beginning to roar to life, he couldn't help but think about the boy with the tattered backpack, the one who had been so misunderstood by Jack just hours before. The child hadn't done anything wrong, but his actions, his innocent quest to find his father, had been misinterpreted in the worst way possible. But in the end, Jack realized that the boy wasn't the only one who had learned something. He too had learned a lesson in humility, in understanding, and in patience. He had learned to trust his instincts, but also to question them, to give people the benefit of the doubt. The plane began its taxi to the runway, and as Jack looked out the window, he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't just the usual calm before a flight, it was something deeper, something personal. He had been given a second chance today, a chance to reflect, to grow, and to improve as a person. The lesson had been hard, but it had been necessary, and Jack knew that he would carry it with him every time he stepped into that cockpit from now on. As the plane lifted off into the sky, Jack glanced out at the horizon, feeling the rush of the wind beneath the wings, and he couldn't help but think that sometimes, redemption didn't come from making everything right, it came from learning to make better decisions in the future. And from that day on, Jack would never forget the boy with the tattered backpack, or the father, who had taught him to think before acting. The events of that day stayed with Captain Jack Peterson long after he flew his plane into the sky. As he ascended into the clouds, the familiar routine of piloting the aircraft took over, but his mind kept returning to the scene at the airport, the boy and his father. It was as if that moment had left a permanent mark on his consciousness, reminding him of how quickly assumptions could spiral out of control. In the world of aviation, where split-second decisions can mean the difference between safety and disaster, there's little room for mistakes, especially when it comes to judgment. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to think clearly under pressure, but that day, his snap judgment had led to an unnecessary escalation. He had been quick to call the police without taking the time to assess the situation properly. In that moment, the urgency of the task had clouded his ability to think through the bigger picture. But Jack now realized that the true test of a professional wasn't just about technical skill, it was about the wisdom to make decisions with patience and understanding. The boy, Michael Carter, had been no threat at all. He had simply been trying to find his father, the FAA Administrator, in a massive, confusing airport. But Jack's inability to see past his own assumptions had nearly turned a harmless situation into something far more dramatic. The consequences could have been disastrous had it not been for Eric Carter's calm demeanor and understanding. Eric had chosen to guide Jack through the situation rather than meet him with anger or retribution, a decision that left a deep impression on Jack. It wasn't just about authority, it was about perspective, patience, and the importance of trusting people before jumping to conclusions. Looking out the cockpit window, Jack thought about how easy it had been to misinterpret the situation. The boy had been alone, his small figure standing by the gate, looking lost. His backpack, worn and tattered, had only added to the illusion of a troubled child, but Jack hadn't bothered to ask what was really going on. He hadn't stopped to question why the boy was there, what he was doing, or who he was looking for. Instead, he had acted on impulse. And now, Jack realized how important it was to stop, breathe, and ask the right questions before making decisions, especially in a world where lives could hang in the balance. The boy had been his teacher, even if he hadn't known it. The entire situation had served as a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. Eric Carter, with his quiet authority, had taught Jack a valuable lesson in humility and understanding. He had chosen to guide Jack through his mistake rather than punish him. That decision, Jack knew, was what had made all the difference. It was a powerful example of how people, especially those in positions of power, could choose to build bridges rather than walls. Jack's thoughts were interrupted as the aircraft leveled off, and he refocused on the task at hand. But as he adjusted the controls and checked the instruments, the lesson he had learned that day stayed with him. The most important thing wasn't always getting it right immediately. It was having the foresight and the humility to learn from the moments we regret most. It was about stepping back, assessing, and knowing that there's always more to the story than what appears at first glance. As we wrap up this unexpected turn of events, remember, the next time you see someone who seems out of place, take a moment to understand the full picture before jumping to conclusions. Life has a way of surprising us, and you never know who might be watching or whose path you might cross. Captain Jack Peterson will never forget the lesson he learned that day, and we can all take something from this story. Patience, understanding, and a little humility go a long way. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that remind us to think before we act. See you next time.